I'm very excited that we have Aaron Klemz with us today. Aaron has 2 master's degrees, one in communications and one in advocacy and political leadership. Something that I really like about Tuesday Group is that it sort of scratches that itch that I have from when I worked in higher education, and I used to get to sit in on different lectures. And Aaron has a lot of experience being a professor, and so we really get to sit in on some expert knowledge today. Aaron is the Chief Strategy Officer for the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, and we are so excited to have him here with us today. Thank you.
Feel a lot of pressure now. Well, first of all, thank you very much for being here, and thanks, of course, to the Grand Emu Lodge for hosting this. And I think it's just a wonderful community tradition that you have, and it's I was really excited to hear about how successful the new resident social was last night, because it really feels like doing great things to try to bring people together around ideas, around fun shared social activities. That's what being in the community is all about, and so I'm really excited to be here to be part of that for my little part of it. And so today what I want to talk about is an idea that MCEA rolled out in December of 2022. And we've been working and having some pretty interesting conversations with a lot of folks about it, and it's called Sundog. A lot of folks know that the polymet mine proposal sits on the former plant site of LTV Erie. And LTV Erie, since it's closed in 2001, has not been doing it. I mean, obviously there's been a lot of fighting and a lot of lawsuits and a lot of other things about polymet, and I'll give you a brief update about the status of those legal cases at some point during this presentation. But really, I wanted to start by pointing out that this is a chance for everyone to think big. I mean, I think one of the things about this moment that we're in, I was in St. Paul last night at the Capitol. I will unfortunately have to go right back to St. Paul after this presentation because the Senate will be taking up the environment and climate bill later this week. But really, we are in an unprecedented moment where we're making significant investments in our environment, in the clean energy and clean transportation revolutions and transitions. And it's a chance for Northeastern Minnesota to really step into a leadership role here. And I hope that you can get some inspiration or at least some thoughts about what we could do, because what I'm going to talk about today is really more of a vision than it is a proposal. I mean, the bottom line is MCEA, for what you know about us, we're an advocacy group. We're not a renewable energy development company. We're not in the business of proposing things that are, and building them. But at the same time, we saw a vacuum and noticed that there really hadn't been big ideas brought to bear on the question of what to do with the LTV Erie plant besides what polymet has proposed. And we wanted to make sure that we were not just setting aside and not contributing to this conversation. So hopefully this is the start of a conversation, and I hope you get some ideas and inspiration today. Quickly about who MCEA is. We're a nonprofit law firm and advocacy organization. We are based in St. Paul and Duluth, Minnesota. We have 33 employees, which is about double what it was when I started there in 2017. So we've grown rapidly, in part because the mission is so important, but also because we have a lot of smart people doing good work, I think. We have 4 program areas: water, climate, Northeastern Minnesota, and healthy communities. And we're kind of unique in that we lobby at the legislature, we work in the agencies and in courts, and we're kind of in all those places at the same time. And that's important because we know that Minnesota's environmental laws don't enforce themselves. That's why sometimes we have to go to court to enforce them. But also what those environmental laws are is very important for what we can go to court to enforce. And so part of the reason why I'm buzzing back to St. Paul after this presentation is to be part of that process and passing what I think is one of the most transformative environmental and climate budgets in the history of Minnesota. Today, it was passed last night off the House floor, and it will be in front of the Minnesota Senate on Thursday. As Lacey previewed, I'm Aaron Klemz. My contact information is here, and I'm happy to give you my card as well. My background is I came out of higher education. I taught at Century College, which is a community college and technical college in White Bear Lake, Minnesota, for over a decade. I was the chair of the communications department there, and really decided that I wanted to get back into advocacy work. And I really enjoyed training students to be good advocates and good public speakers, but I also wanted to do that for myself and to be able to be part of that conversation on issues that I cared about. So I went back for a second master's degree at the University of Minnesota Duluth in advocacy and political leadership. And currently my role at MCEA has me supervising the communications and legislative and project management and Northeastern Minnesota work of MCEA. So top line outline here, first of all, is that we are at this unprecedented moment where we have massive amounts of resources that are being directed toward the clean energy and clean transportation revolution, both at the federal level through the Inflation Reduction Act and also state legislative action that's happening right now. And that gives northeastern Minnesota a real opportunity to lead as opposed to following on this clean energy revolution. And I'll talk about some ideas for that. Secondly, I'll outline what the Sundog alternative vision for the LTV Erie plant site is and where it came from and what some of its features are. And lastly, I'll talk about some of the work that MCEA is doing about where to get the metals needed for the clean energy revolution and transition. That does not involve cracking open new holes in the earth. We have a huge amount of already mined minerals and already mined metals sitting in junk drawers, in the backs of closets. And we think that that's the first place we should be looking for to get these metals, whether it's copper, nickel, platinum, palladium. And there's some really interesting research that I'll share with you from folks doing e-waste recycling work in Minnesota, talking about the potential for what we could tap into if we really focused on collecting and processing the e-waste that we're producing and we already have in our closets. So this is a shot that you've probably seen many times before. It's on most of the press coverage. It feels like at some point someone should update the cover image of the LTV Erie plant, but this is, I think, 2002, about 6 or 7 months after it closed for good. And this site, there has been some work here, of course. There's been some of these buildings no longer exist. Most of them still do. And there's a lot of, but there hasn't been a lot of work beyond that. And what we're hoping to do today is to talk a little bit about a different vision for what some of those buildings in this land can turn into. Before I do that, I want to start, though, by talking it through a brief history, and much of this for you will be familiar for some of you. But if you're not, a quick refresher that in 1957, Erie mining opened. Remember, at that time, Minnesota had invested heavily in the University of Minnesota process to create taconite, and a number of large steel producers in the United States formed these conglomerates to basically provide the feedstock for their blast furnaces down water in Chicagoland and in other parts of the Great Lakes. And the employment peaked at 3,100 workers in 1971. I just want to underscore that when I drove into Ely this morning, the population was 3,298 according to the sign, right? So we're talking about a massive operation with thousands of workers, and that was the peak. And from that point down, it slowly deteriorated. Over time, many of these jobs were lost. One key moment was in 1978 when LTV Corporation, which was a French company, acquired a portion of Erie mining, and in 1984 they became the full owner. And then the story gets a little bit sadder because we see retrenchment in a lot of ways. You see a reduction in employment, a lot of financial problems as the ore quality got lower and lower as it came closer and closer to being mined out. It got worse and worse. And in 1999, one day after the state of Minnesota filed a tax lien against the LTV Corporation, they filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, which was the signal that things were about to fall apart. And from that point forward, it fell apart pretty rapidly. By May 2000, LTV announced the Howard Lakes plant would close. By January 2001, LTV had ended operations, laid off the remaining 1,400 workers. And unfortunately, that wasn't even the end of the story. In 2002, a lot of the promises that were made to workers were then reneged upon. So they defaulted on their pension obligations, turned it over the pensions to the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, which caused them to be slashed at least in half, and for some people more than that. There was lifelong health insurance commitments that were also reversed. And so over 3,500 people who had been guaranteed supposedly lifelong health insurance for their employment at the LTV Erie mine lost those benefits. I say this all to kind of set the scene for something, which I think is important to note. So 20 years ago, LTV Erie closed, and this is a traumatic event. This is a traumatic event for a community. Hoyt Lakes was literally purpose-built to house miners for the Erie operation. And I don't think we've ever really grappled with it quite the way that it needed to. I mean, we have the IRRB, whose purpose is to step in at times of a mine closure and to address that dislocation, economic and otherwise, that comes from that loss. And here we are 20 years later, still talking about LTV Erie in ways that suggest that we haven't really figured out what that trauma is or how we're going to address it. So I think the first two bullets I just covered, but I'll just skip down a little bit below. LTV Erie, when it went bankrupt, it distributed its assets to a variety of creditors. Okay. Minnesota Power, for example, received the Taconite Harbor coal plant, which operated until I think a few years ago and closed and is now in decommissioning and closure. Cleveland Cliffs received the plant site, picture of which I just showed you. And funnily enough, the IRRB received the tailings basin as an asset in bankruptcy, which it's not an asset at all. It's clearly a liability, and it continues to be a liability to this day. So I think that last detail is one thing that I didn't know at first when I started doing this research, and it makes me think very differently about this whole process. Knowing that the IRRB has a liability to get rid of, it really suggests part of the reason why they're so enthusiastically or have enthusiastically backed the Polymet mine proposal on this site, in part because it helps them get out from underneath a significant liability. In 2004, Cliff sells the plant sites to Polymet for a prospective copper nickel mine. And if you recall, at that time, Teck was also very interested in the plant site. In fact, they got Gino Paolucci to back them in their request to the Department of Economic Development for a $35 million loan in 2003 to purchase the plant site. But Polymet swooped in, purchased it from underneath them. And now the irony is that we're talking about a joint venture between Teck and Polymet 20 years later. At the time, they were very much competitors for that site. And the last thing I'm going to mention here is just the proposal to build the coal gasification power plant, which emerged almost on the heels of the closure of LTV Erie. Because I think it's an example of what I'll call a litany of failed proposals. I mean, there have been a litany of failed proposals at this site, almost all of them beginning with the assertion that we need to do something to replace the jobs that were lost because LTV Erie closed. The biggest one, and I think the one that we invested the most ill-gotten public money in, was the Mesaba Energy Clean Coal Power Plant, which lost over $9 million in a loan from IRRB to Mesaba Energy. In addition, $22 million of federal dollars was spent, and another $10 million in state money. So, $41 million in all told was burned in the attempts to build a coal gasification power plant, which now sounds like a cartoon villain's plot for what to do with this site after closure. Of course, there are other ones too. Mesabi Nugget, which briefly operated for about 3 years, but closed quite quickly. Segatis proposed a green biochemistry power plant. Stop me if you're recalling some of these stories. And every one of these gets announced to great fanfare. Every one of these gets big chunks of state money, or at least promises of state support. A siding manufacturing plant, which was also a secret for a while about who was proposing the siding manufacturing plant. And then what's ironic about this is in many cases, there were proposals that started at the Hoyt Lakes area and then moved. So the first thing is, you need to give us money, state support, to support this community that's been devastated. But as soon as things start to get tough, they move. So for example, the coal gasification plant was moved eventually, or proposed to be moved to Taconite, Minnesota. And then they chose to try to change it to a gas power plant, and they dropped it altogether. Segatis was announced to great fanfare. I think they promised up to $20 million in federal and state support. It never got built. And the siding manufacturing plant, I think we've seen, it was, again, 65 million, I think, was promised for that. Never got built. And they all trade on the trauma of the LTV Erie closure to garner political support, financial subsidies, and all of them have failed. I mean, the Mesabi Nugget did operate for a time to provide a few jobs, but beyond that, the other proposals that I'm talking about never came to be at all. Meanwhile, Polymet itself is one of these proposals. Let's just be really clear about that. And their permits are all in trouble. And I know that there are people who have different opinions about this, and you can talk to anyone you want. I'll give you my opinion, and I'm happy to discuss it with you. But my opinion is that we're looking at the end days of this proposal because the permits are not going to be upheld by the courts and by agencies. The permit to mine is the main one that's issued by the DNR. As you recall, the Supreme Court reversed that permit in 2022, ordered a contested case hearing that was held just at the end of last month on a very specific issue called bentonite and whether it would be able to prevent pollution from basically filtering through the tailings after closure and then coming out the toe of that tailings basin. And there are several other issues, including the term of that permit and whether or not Glencore or Teck or New Range or whatever they're calling it these days should be on the permit. Now you can make sure that the parent company is responsible for any financial problems if that emerges. All of that is currently in process. The contested case hearing was held this last month. We expect a recommendation from the administrative law judge in that case, probably sometime in August. And at that point, the DNR would then have to decide what to do with the permit. And the craziest part about all this is once they make decisions, if they decide to reissue that permit has never been adjudicated, and it will go right back to the Court of Appeals for an actual appeal about whether it meets Minnesota state law, assuming that folks do appeal that permit, which I think is like, the water pollution permit is currently awaiting a decision at the Supreme Court. Ironically, it's already been reversed by the Court of Appeals. Well, that means on a specific legal issue, whether or not they have accounted for groundwater pollution that will surface very quickly into the surface water. There are other issues, including whether or not the EPA and their comments that were concerned about the water permit was suppressed and kept out of the public view, and whether or not there are other reasons why the permit should be struck down. The Supreme Court heard those arguments in January. We expect a decision probably again in summer of this year. The wetlands permit has been stayed by the U.S. Army Corps in response to the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewa's challenge to the wetlands permit on the basis that it would violate their water quality standards for mercury downstream, as well as other contaminants. And the EPA has already recommended that it not be reissued because it will violate their water quality standards and send a pulse of mercury and high conductivity water, which is salty, sulfate-laden water downstream. And we are awaiting a decision from the Army Corps of Engineers on that permit, but if they follow the EPA's recommendation, they will not only take the permit away, but that ore body itself will probably be basically off limits. Because if you can't dig up that surface deposit and not violate the water quality standards downstream, it's going to be very hard to redesign the project around that conclusion. And there's two other ones that are just kind of hanging out there. The air permit, we're waiting a Supreme Court decision on a technical issue to see whether it will go back to the Court of Appeals. And the dam safety permits are all waiting what happens with that permit to mine stuff at the top. So this is I start here because I think it's super important. I've heard Representative Stauber on the floor of the US House say that PolyMed has won every court case they've been up against. And as somebody who's involved in those court cases, I find that shocking, quite honestly. It's impossible to argue that PolyMed has won these cases. They say this weird thing about how any case that's reached final resolution, which basically means as long as they keep fighting, they always win, which is not how this has worked. The truth is, this is a deeply flawed proposal. The permits that were issued in 2018, here we are 5 years later, and they're still not anywhere close to being in shape. And it's because they're not good permits. They don't protect Minnesota's environment and the people who live downstream. So for all of that, there's another side of this question too, which is if not that, then what? I mean, I hear that all the time from people, right? They say, what do you want? What do you propose? What do you think should happen? And for a long time, I will say that internally MCEA resisted this idea because it's like, well, look, we're not an economic development agency. That's somebody else's job. Okay. But that's not right. I mean, I think, and it took a while for, I think, this conversation to really develop inside of our organization and elsewhere to say, like, look, it's not our job to necessarily provide those jobs, but I think it is important for people to have a vision about what we would say instead, right? I mean, and hopefully be part of that conversation because, it's just going to be about utility companies and renewable developers, but ultimately, like, we think there's a real potential for reusing that site, the LTV Erie sites, to host really a innovative and important and transformative clean energy project that could really do two things. One, it could clean up an existing site that's still polluting. Since 2001, when it closed, it continues to pollute. And secondly, to really provide clean energy for an existing mining industry, right? We have existing taconite mines that are producing. As you know, 1978, again, I think it was roughly the peak of taconite mining employment, around 13,500 people across the range. These mines today produce nearly the same amount of ore, but they employ about 4,000, right? So we're talking about 1/3 the workforce for the same amount of ore in the span of about 40 years. And so, this is a moment where if we want to preserve, I think, those 4,000 jobs for the long haul, and if we want to create a sustainable long-term industry, we have to understand that we're competing globally, first of all, in the commodities market. And the way around that is to provide a value-added product. In this case, the value-added product is clean steel and carbon-free, ideally, steel. Because I think, as you've seen, worldwide, there's a rapid shift toward a lot of attention being paid to the climate issue, but also the role that construction materials play in that climate issue. Concrete and steel being the two primary inputs that have a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. In order for this to happen, a lot of things would have to happen. I'm going to be blunt with you. Like, it's not like I can just walk in and buy polymet from underneath them. I don't have $500 million, whatever it would take. But ultimately, I think if the permits, for example, become such a stumbling block that people start to think about alternatives, for example, or if a government were to get really interested in trying to figure out an alternative path, the way to do this would be as follows. You have to acquire that plant site, which is really more of a liability than an asset at this point. It is leaking out of the base of that tailings basin. It continues to send sulfates downstream. The existing site liability is estimated at over $100 million to clean up that site, specifically to stabilize that tailings basin would be the most expensive part of that. And I think for the vision to work, you'd have to have a plant site that could be developed by somebody. And it's not going to be government, but government probably has to play a role here. Secondly, constructing a 300 to 400 megawatt solar array on the capped tailings basin and surrounding brownfields. If you've been on this site, you know that there are thousands of acres of brownfields on this site. The old mined out areas from the LTV Erie mine. And the tailings basin itself is over 1,000 acres. 300 to 400 megawatts is very large. To give you some context for that, the largest solar array in Minnesota right now, I think, is at around 220 megawatts. There's one proposed for the Becker plant, replacing the coal plant that's going to be closing in 2032, and it's going to be 460 megawatts. But we're probably talking about 2,000 acres or so of solar to make that amount. To really make this work, I think you need to have some kind of battery storage and or a green hydrogen production facility on this site. Green hydrogen is particularly interesting because there are examples being developed worldwide of clean steel being developed using green hydrogen. So Luleå, Sweden is the place to look if you want to do some investigation on this. SSAB, which is a company that actually has a location in St. Paul, about a mile from MCEA's office, where it's more of a retail place, but they're a steel producer. They're the ones that are operating and building that. Here in the United States, we have another example that's close to that, which is that in the Bighorn project in Colorado, Xcel Energy has built a 300 megawatt solar array next to an existing steel plant. And now they've replaced, it's an electric arc furnace. So it uses a lot of electricity and it's going to be 100% solar. And it already is. And so there is examples both in the United States and worldwide of this, but for us to really tap into it, we'd have to make a commitment to trying to finally build a steel production facility on the range that would use green hydrogen, which would be much less polluting, but also much less carbon intensive. Lastly, you may know that there's 250 megawatts of hydropower that's been purchased from Manitoba Hydro that Minnesota Power is tapped into. That's good. I mean, there are some challenges with that hydro stuff, to be honest, like the Manitoba Hydro plants. There's a lot of controversy about them, and particularly the impact on Indigenous people and First Nations in Canada. So I don't want to give short shrift to that. But as a carbon-free fuel source, it is one of those, it's kind of ideal because it's baseload, right? It's always coming. A lot of the other renewables, including solar, go up and down, depending on whatever resource it is that's providing them. Hydro gives you a nice level, solid base, and gives you the opportunity to add more stuff on top of it to really transform the industrial economy of northeastern Minnesota. Here's another view of this idea, but give you a sense of scale of the size of the tailings basin and what it would look like with solar panels on it. And also, just one more thing, there aren't a lot of examples of tailings basins with solar on it, but there are two, and there are two very new ones, actually. So there are folks developing the technology about how you would anchor this. One of the challenges is you want to cap that tailings basin, and you don't want to then immediately drill holes in the cap, right? So you have to find ways to put piers basically on top of that to anchor those panels to. But we've been assured by both a couple of renewable developers that this is an additional problem. It would add some expense, but it does not make it impossible to install on this site. And also, if you've been on the site, you know that it's on top of a big ridge, the Biwabik Mountains. Sounds a little bit grandiose to me, potentially, but you know, it is not a terrible place for some wind resource. It certainly wouldn't be the primary source, but it would be something that'd be worthwhile to add to the mix. there's a really great financial case for this. And so if any of you have $1 billion, let's talk afterward and I can tell you how to take advantage of some of this stuff. But the Inflation Reduction Act, as you know, Pat, provided a lot of money to develop it's called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And the biggest one is the extension and development of further solar incentives. And these solar incentives are basically like a 30% base, and there are 10% additions that are given that are site specific. And this site happens to be all of the things. It is in a what they call an energy community where a coal plant was closed because of the coal facility that fed it, Taconite Harbor, being closed. It is in a low income area, which would also be eligible for a 10% reduction. It is a brownfield site. That is also another potential 10% addition. So all told, you could get up to a 60% investment tax credit to develop a solar array on this site. And let me assure you that there are solar developers scrambling across the United States to look for this right now. Part of the reason why this site is also very desirable is it has very good power infrastructure to and from the site that is brand new. And that is the number one thing that solar developers are looking for right now, is the ability to tap into the grid. In many places, oversubscription has meant that solar developers have to sit in a long interconnection queue. In this case, you have brand new transmission lines that have just been constructed from the Taconite Harbor facility to the LTV Erie facility and then back toward the rest of the range. And eventually, Great River Energy and Minnesota Power are building a new backbone that will take power from the range or vice versa down to St. Cloud. That would connect two of the largest solar arrays in the state of Minnesota if those two things were to be connected that way. In addition to the solar incentives, there's a whole host of other funds that are available for battery storage facilities, green hydrogen, and decarbonizing the steel industry. There's specific money for decarbonizing the steel industry, right? And it seems to me like failing to take advantage of that would be a huge missed opportunity for Northeastern Minnesota. In my view, PolyMet's likely to fail. I think it probably already has. And I think we're sitting around waiting to find out what the aftermath of that will be, whatever the gyrations are between PolyMet and Glencore and Tech. The bottom line is, if this were a healthy project, it would have moved forward a lot faster than it has. And it's not simply the legal cases that have held it up, but it's the lack of commitment. There's a heavy dependence on existing taconite mines, and that means that future-proofing that industry is important. I mean, there's been a lot of gyrations around, for example, Hibbing taconite and the potential closure of it if they don't find more ore, right? We just watched North Shore idle for a year, right? And over supposedly a dispute about royalties, but let's just be honest, it really was because they didn't need the ore at that time. It was not about a $3 million dispute between the royalty holder and the company. If that is, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. They lost tens of millions of dollars in revenue over $3 million a year. And there's a long-standing, strong state support for steel manufacturing on the Iron Range. I mean, that was the vision of Minnesota Steel Industries that became SR, that became whatever it's called these days. You know, that was the whole idea. It was not build another mine on top of the Butler Taconite site. It was, let's put a steel mill up here. That was what people wanted. That's what Tom Bach wanted. Okay, I'm sure Tom Bach probably stood in this place and so told you the same story, right? And if there is a way to get to a steel production facility in northeastern Minnesota, it is through clean green steel. It is not through using coal to make steel. And there's a number of things in the bill that literally just passed the House last night that could be used to finance and to find the money to build a facility like this. Oh, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm confused, but I understood that steel is made from iron and carbon.
Mm-hmm. So the traditional way to make steel involves using coking coal, yeah, right? So and the clean steel approach uses the green hydrogen to provide the heat, right? So rather than using coal to provide the heat, so there's other components in steel besides just iron and carbon, right? There's also chromium, there's also nickel, right? It's depending on the formulation of steel you're trying to get to, and there's a bazillion different recipes for that. But the fundamental difference is you're replacing that coking coal with green hydrogen as part of that process.
And the coal is just used to heat the iron? Is that what you're saying?
It's the primary use of it. Yeah. There's some other adjustments that need to be made to that process, but the primary difference is where the energy comes from.
Okay, so the coal, the carbon does not enter the iron molecules?
I wouldn't say there's no carbon in it. I mean, carbon free is hard to achieve,
Yeah.
right? I mean, and I don't think anyone, for all the talk of 100% clean energy and stuff like that, I mean, ultimately, like we know that there's a need for carbon in the economy. It's more about how you deal. But I will confess, I'm not 100% an expert on the steel making process. I do understand the basics of it and how these two things fit together. Before I go on to the next thing, I just want to kind of like sum up here and talk a little bit about this because I think it's super important to think about a few big takeaways. One is that solar is coming. Okay, it is coming to northeastern Minnesota specifically. In the last Minnesota Power and Resource Plan, which was just approved by the Public Utilities Commission this last year, they had committed to building 300 megawatts of solar, which is the number you just heard. Okay, so right now, Minnesota Power built a relatively small array just about 3 miles from where I'm talking about. Just outside the Alaskan Energy Plant, they added a 10 megawatt solar array. And it's really important to keep that in mind because we're really well positioned here. I mean, like the Helliane plant has just gone through an upgrade. 500 megawatts of solar panels are rolling off their production line every year at this point. You could theoretically build this thing with Minnesota-made solar panels to create Minnesota-made jobs for the manufacturing, as well as producing clean energy that could be used to clean up an existing taconite industry that needs to have a hook to survive. Because let's just be really honest, Australian mines are producing iron ore at $20 a ton, and they could ship direct to China. If you can't beat that financially as a commodity product. You can, however, beat it if you've got a better product. No, go ahead, Ray.
Yeah, Aaron, I don't want to put you on the spot. I know
Sure.
you've got a chart or something to help you with this, but I think you said maybe a maximum of 400 megawatts out of the Sundog project. And you mentioned that Minnesota Power has a 300 megawatt solar array. How much power is 300 megawatts in terms of, like, how much is used in the Minnesota area or in St. Louis County?
Yeah,
Do you have a sense of that?
I do. And I'm gonna use things like, I'm gonna use terms like number of households, which of
Yeah.
course is weird because I mean, I think it's really hard to get a feel for like how much power is consumed by the taconite mines, in part because it's proprietary. They don't even tell you, like you can't even see it in the filings to the Public Utilities Commission. But what we've heard at the legislature, for example, from the Iron Mining Association is that the Mintac plant uses basically the equivalent of the energy consumed by the entire city of Minneapolis on a daily basis. Okay, this is a huge amount of power. The 400 megawatts would be roughly like 250 to 300,000 households worth of power. Right now, of course, the problem is smoothing it all out because there will be times in mid-July in the middle of the day that you're maxing this thing out. And there'll be times in January where it's cloudy and it won't be doing much at all, right? So that's one of the challenges as well, is how do you smooth out that sine wave a little bit. But you know, this is a significant amount of energy. Like I said, 250 megawatts is the base load coming in on the Great Northern Transmission Line from Manitoba Hydro. And so according to Minnesota Power, they say that that's roughly half of their total power. So when you say 300 megawatts of solar, it's not a 1-for-1 because there's a capacity utilization factor that you use to figure that out, right? Because it's not 100%. So like if you assume that the hydro is 100%, it's always flowing. I think the capacity utilization for solar is generally estimated at between 10 and 15%. So I don't know if that helps a little bit, but it gives you a sense of like, it's big. It would largely replace what is being generated by coal already from the Cohasset, which will have to happen, by the way, because by 2034, Minnesota Power has already said that they're going to close that plant. So they have to come up with an alternative. One other thing I just want to clarify is I didn't say that Minnesota Power has a 300 megawatt array yet, but they've committed to building 300 megawatts of solar over the next 15 years as part of their resource plan. Yeah, one more question.
Yeah, so is within this, are there thoughts about developing batteries?
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned it because I've totally spaced the thing that I wanted to talk about, which is so 4 minutes. Thank you very much. I should have you follow me around and remind me of things I forgot to talk about. Everyone's heard about lithium-ion batteries, right? You've seen them, whether it's a Powerwall or it's in your EV. That's the thing everyone thinks about right now. Okay. The thing that utilities are thinking about though is how do we generate longer term power? Because those lithium ion batteries discharge in about 4 hours for their utility scale operations. That's not even enough to go overnight, right, for a solar array. So one of the technologies that I'm most excited about and that is actually rapidly developing and has a direct connection here is Form Energy, which is a company that's, I think, headquartered in Massachusetts. They're talking about building their production facility in West Virginia. And what they do is they use iron pellets and basically the chemical operation of rust to move electrons from one side of the battery to the other. And if the problem with these batteries is they are massive, right? Each one of these cells is like a giant cylinder full of iron pellets and a matrix that goes around it. And they basically use kind of like almost a material like Gore-Tex that allows you to move the electrons from one side of the battery to the other. The thing is, like, but they also have a tremendous amount of time, like 120-hour battery. So 4 days or more of battery discharge. And so you need a huge amount of space. And guess what we have? This giant building. If you have not taken the tour of the LTV Erie facility and gone into the crushing building, you don't know how huge it is. It's massive. It could be reused certainly for that purpose of housing those battery cells. There is a 1 megawatt battery pilot for this being built in Cambridge, Minnesota right now by Great River Energy. But there is a rapid scale up happening. Form Energy is planning to deploy hundreds of megawatts of batteries over the next 5 to 6 years. And quite honestly, and they're looking to build another manufacturing facility. And it makes no sense to me that West Virginia would be the place to do it. When literally the iron is being manufactured here. All that stuff you heard about DR grade pellets and the enhancements that have been made to the taconite plants, those are primarily for different formulations of steel making. Okay. But those DR grade processes could be used to create the pellets that are used in this iron battery as well. So imagine an iron air battery manufactured with Minnesota iron that's used to support the taconite industry and create a clean green steel facility here in Minnesota. On top of it, we're using Minnesota manufactured solar panels to do it. I mean, it literally is a potential Minnesota miracle for clean energy. And a lot of people ask the question next, which is, well, where are you going to get the stuff? Where are you going to get the metals from? I hear this all the time. Like, I'm at the Capitol all the time, and that's the first question that comes out of a lot of people's mouths. And we've spent a lot of time over the last year as MCEA really digging deep into this question of, what is the alternative, right? I do want to highlight something really important at the beginning of this stuff, which is I think that this question is a little bit disingenuous, more than a little bit sometimes. What I mean by that is I've been asked, how are you going to solve all of the materials challenges for the entire clean energy revolution all at once? And the alternative that's proposed is we'll open the polymet mine, or we'll open a twin metals mine, or we'll open a talon mine. And if you add all of those proposals together, they're like a rounding error on the global production of these metals. They are not a solution to the entirety of the global metals supply. Now, we're going to need mining, I think, to be able to reach that. There's no doubt about that. Because we're always asked, so you're saying close all the mines and just recycle stuff. I'm like, no, I didn't say that. But I do think we have the option to make good choices about where we site, where we locate, and how we treat the water downstream of these mining proposals. So unless I say alternatives to new greenfield mining for metals, because I'm not suggesting we close mines tomorrow. If anything, the production of iron is becoming even more important for the renewable energy revolution as we are developing better technologies. We're definitely in flux right now about what metals are going to be needed, right? I mean, a few years ago, if you ask people, they would have said, we need a ton of cobalt. Cobalt is super important. There's only really one place to get it. There's very few places in the world that have it. There are very small amounts of cobalt in the ore of northeastern Minnesota, but really 80 to 85% of the production is in Congo, okay? The problems are that A, it's expensive, and B, there's a huge human rights and environmental catastrophe in Congo around the mining of cobalt. And what you've seen is a massive and quick run away from that material by Tesla, by others, who are looking for better battery manufacturing that would be less energy intensive and also avoid some of these problems. And the cost, let's just be honest, it's mostly cost. The upshot is that we have the new batteries that are being put into Teslas are what they call LFP batteries, or lithium ferrophosphate batteries. Ferro meaning iron. So now all of a sudden, These are a little bit less energy dense batteries, but they're a lot cheaper to manufacture and the materials are way more available than cobalt and nickel are. And you're going to see this kind of material substitution happening over and over again in the battery industry and elsewhere. So just a quick thing that I'll run through is some of what we've been looking into about e-waste, and I'll give you an opportunity if you want to learn more about it. The talking point has shifted. Okay, like if I were talking to you 5 years ago, the only talking point that you would have heard from the other side would have been jobs, 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 jobs. Okay, well, guess what? We've got a 1.6% unemployment rate or something ridiculous like that. We've got a real problem with finding workers more than we have a problem with providing jobs at this point. Certainly wages matter a great deal, and family sustaining jobs are different than jobs that don't sustain families. I get all that. But ultimately, the switch has been dramatic to the idea that copper nickel mining is needed to address the climate crisis. And you've seen this suddenly, I mean, like literally Polymer puts press releases now that say things like climate metals. You know, I mean, I never saw that before a couple of years ago. I mean, this is all brand new. And I think that the truth of this talking point is less important than how it functions, right? First of all, let's just be blunt. President Biden is in office, not President Trump. So suddenly, like, what are we going to do to appeal to President Biden as opposed to President Trump? Let's talk about climate. He seems to care about that stuff, okay? Number one. And number two, I think people who care about climate change, before there was just kind of a denial, a straight denial. You would have heard from Polyman and others basically like a kind of like, not sure climate change is happening 5 or 6 years ago. Now they embrace the idea and see it as an economic opportunity. But there are a lot of people out there who care about climate change, who care about their consumption, know that there's no free lunch. And when they buy something new, like a car or a computer, it comes with a cost and it comes with materials that came from somewhere. And this is kind of a route to absolution, right? If you support this copper nickel mine here where we're going to do it right, quote unquote, then you can be absolved from your consumption. Meanwhile, the average American household has 81 e-waste devices in their home. I mean, that's a tremendous number. I mean, and when I heard this number, I kind of went rummaging around my own house and I found like 40 things. I mean, at least 40 things. And we've talked to a lot of experts. So like Adam Minter, who if you're not familiar with his work, he's fantastic. He is actually someone who was my high school debate team of all things. But now is primarily Bloomberg's recycling, e-waste, and scrap trade correspondent. He's been located in Shanghai and Indonesia. We had some really great webinars and conversations with him and some other local leaders on this question to try to come up with what would make sense as a Minnesota strategy for how to create a policy agenda that addresses this metal need without tapping in new holes in the ground. And the two big ones are right to repair, which is going to extend the length of electronics that we use, and has already gotten some traction at the Capitol, and another set of initiatives around e-waste recycling. So in Minnesota, we capture less than 1/4 of the e-waste we produce. Okay, just think about that for a minute. Less than 1/4 of what we produce in electronic waste is captured and recycled. The rest of it is either stockpiled in your home or it's landfill, right? Those are pretty much your options. And here's the challenge. We're doing a terrible job of incentivizing collection of e-waste. So Minnesota's e-waste law was passed in 2007, and it's not a bad law. It certainly wasn't at the time that it was passed. But what it did was it established what they call an extended producer responsibility approach, where basically manufacturers create their own system of credits that's supposed to create a market for recycled metals at the end of life. But what it doesn't incentivize is the collection of those devices. It incentivizes the second layer of that, which is the processing of that waste once it is collected. The idea at the time was there needed to be markets for that metal. Those markets exist. Okay, they exist these days. But the problem is we don't have a good system of collection. So right now, if you had if you had an old laptop, where would you take it today to get it recycled? Best Buy's not bad, and they're doing some stuff voluntarily that's good. The truth is that in many places across Minnesota, those answers are not easy to come by. And if there is a place, it probably costs you money to recycle that device. And that's stupid. I mean, let's just be honest. It should be free. It should be ubiquitous. It should be everywhere. And it can be. And there are states that are incentivizing that first layer of collection because the markets do exist for these metals. So Maria Jensen at Repowered has been a kind of partner on this question, and they've worked with academics as well as some folks in the Iron Range Partnership for Sustainability to create a really interesting paper about Minnesota's e-waste and what potential is there. And their conclusion is that we could produce enough metals to build, I think, something like 35,000 EVs every year if we just captured the metal that we're currently landfilling here in Minnesota. And ultimately, I think this issue needs more visibility, regardless of what you think about the mining stuff. Let's just all agree. I mean, I was on a panel with Mining Minnesota's Julie Lucas a few months ago at the Solar Industry Conference, and we had 100% agreement on this question. 100%. Like, why would we ever not reuse and get the maximum use out of these metals, especially copper, which is one of the most recyclable metals out there, as well as nickel? They're both 100% recyclable. And so there's no reason why we shouldn't be doing more of that. And you can learn more about that this Saturday. I know there's a lot of things going on Saturday here in Ely, but if you want to drive down the road an hour and go to Virginia at the Earth Fest at the new arena there, there will be a bunch of folks there, including MCEA staff, who'll be talking about the work that we're doing out of Duluth and elsewhere across northeastern Minnesota. But I think at 1:45 p.m., you might be particularly interested in the presentation by Maria and the co-authors of this study, talking about what they're thinking about for an agenda for e-waste recycling in Minnesota and what they know about what the potential is. Yeah, go ahead.
Just coins could be recycled. There's 75 to 90% copper. And
depending on the era of the coin, I'm a coin geek, I gotta admit. But pre-1982, you're right, they were primarily copper. The new ones are mostly zinc. Mostly zinc.
Oh,
So they're the copper coating on the outside of a zinc coin, basically. Yeah. And I mean, obviously you can go back further. I mean, pre-1963 it was all silver, 90% silver. So I still, my grandmother was a lunch lady, and she would bring home the silver coins that the kids would bring in, which I'm sure were probably not intended to be spent at the lunch lady's cash register, but at the same time, yeah, I mean, I think there is a lot of coins there, and I mean, I tried to do the math one time about like how many pennies would you have to recycle in order to it's a lot. I mean, it's a lot, but but that certainly has a source there, and quite honestly, given inflation, what a penny is worth these days is kind of hard to discern.
Well, I did the math on quarters, and it was like, I forget what it was, $4 for a pound of copper or something.
Yeah.
Something.
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of places to look, but like I said, I mean, the junk drawer. I mean, I wrote a piece for the Star Tribune where I talked about there's a strategic stockpile of metals. It's not the one you're thinking of, it's the one that's in your junk drawer, right? And I think that's exactly right. A lot of folks don't understand how much metal they have sitting around. So if you want to look more into this, I literally like today launched a new tab on our website called Critical Conversations under the How We Win tab. And all the materials that Abby Rogerson out of our Duluth office has been working on for this, as well as webinars with Adam Mentor and other folks, are all there. And we're answering your questions too. So if you want to ask questions of us about what the potential is here, what the problems might be, you can submit a question and we'll answer it on our website as well, and we'll let you know when we do that. So please take a look at our website. I also just want to conclude by this guy right here. This is the site where the mine would go if Polymet opens. You've seen pictures, like the beginning picture, we'll go all the way back just because I feel like I want to show it. This is what you think of when you think about Polymet, right? It's the picture you see on the television, it's the picture you see on all the news coverage. But that's where the mine would go. They would dig that up, right? And that's mostly wetlands, mostly bog, mostly peat. And thousands and thousands of acres of what is right now a functional, important ecosystem would be lost, right? So, keep that in mind as we're thinking about what to do with the plant site. It's a brownfield, it's something we can redevelop. We should think about the best way to use it. But a side effect and an important one would be preservation of this site, hopefully, for the next generation and the generations that follow. So thank you for your kind attention, and I'm happy to answer questions in the 5 minutes that I have left. All right. And I'll stick around, of course, if you have questions. I'd be happy to chat afterward.
I worked at a place where we had some solar panels on the roof, and they worked in the winter when it was sunny. But when it snowed, we had to hire a guy to go up and knock the snow off. How do these big fields up here north where it snows, how do those panels get cleared off?
There's a couple of ways that they do that. Sometimes it's just manual labor, as you said. I mean, and that's probably part of the job, really, of maintaining a solar array of that size in this climate. There are also like heating elements, other things you can use to try to include, and also the slope of it matters a great deal. So if you get it right, you know, when it starts to melt a little bit, it just slides right off. So it really depends on the orientation of it toward the sun, and there are some other techniques they use. But generally, I mean, this idea that like if it snows, the solar panels are useless. I mean, I think if you install a flat panel on a roof and don't have any plan for what to do with getting the snow off of it, yeah, it probably is pretty useless. But there are lots of ways to address that problem. But I'll also be honest, like winter production for a solar, I mean, up this far north, right, there's shorter days. I mean, 7 hours and 45 minutes of daylight, you know, when you're talking about late December. And so the difference between that is kind of made up though for in June when you've got 16 hours of sunlight. So, you know, we are a little bit more on the kind of bigger extreme of the sine wave for solar, but there are lots of solar arrays at this latitude or higher that have been developed worldwide. And it's definitely not something that you can't deal with in terms of snow. Sorry, go ahead.
Obviously, your Sundog concept is very well developed, and I'm curious of two things. One, is there a feasibility study that you've done behind that? And secondly, you've obviously socialized it with the legislature or members of the legislature. What kind of research have you done?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, so thank you for reminding me. I should say that. So the question was, have you done a feasibility study? And what has been the reaction from legislators and others who you've talked to about this proposal? Question number one, no, not as a, there have been like, we've tested the feasibility of big parts of this proposal. So looking at things like, what is the status of the transmission grid to and from this site? Thumbs up, right? Can you put these panels on this site? Yes, say a number of engineers and solar developers we talked to. Our challenge, of course, is we don't control the site. So like to do an actual full feasibility study, you'd have to have willing partners who would want you to go on the site and really dig into it. We have not run into anything yet that suggests that it's not feasible. So no study, but I think it's pretty clear after talking to, I mean, we talked to Minnesota Power about it. And they're like, yeah, you could do that. I mean, like they didn't say they were going to do it, but they said they could do that. And then I think the other thing that you mentioned was like, how are people reacting to it? I think the thing that we hear most is from folks who are big proponents of the copper nickel mining industry. They say, let's just do both. Okay, which isn't really discouraging me from putting this idea out there. I mean, it feels like no one has come up with a reason why this is not practical or feasible. I think that there is some question about cost. There is, of course, questions about the site itself, especially the cleanup of the existing site liability, right? But beyond that, I think that, you know, people have been intrigued and interested and want to know more. I think the real challenge is going to be to break through. I think there's going to need to be a moment of reckoning about the status of the PolyMet project as a whole, right? And I think there are lots of ways that could come true. Either one of the major permits or multiple major permits are overturned in a way that makes it very difficult for them to move forward. It could include corporate governance stuff. I really am confused, quite honestly, about the tech Glencore PolyMet gyrations, and I follow that stuff probably closer than anyone that's not in the stock space of it. There's a lot of lack of clarity about what's really happening here. And the Mesaba deposit that Tech owns is about 3 miles further down the road, further east of the PolyMet NorthMet deposit, but it's basically the same ore body, right? But they haven't done anything in regards to environmental review or permitting or anything. So if they were to start from scratch, you know, it would be quite a bit of work for them to catch up to where PolyMet is. And PolyMet is not looking like a going concern. So I don't know. I think the second part is interesting to me too, because I think we haven't made a proposal, considered whether we would want to do some kind of solar incentive that could be more broadly applied. But we're looking and talking to other folks about next session and what might be available. But just one more thing I'll say is that money's not a problem. I mean, like that sounds really weird for me to say that, but like ultimately the federal incentives that are available is really, I mean, there is independent developers have contacted me to say, I want to know more about this.
Private industry is desperately.
Yes.
And the big problem is the grid.
Yep. I mean, it was weird too, like, I didn't realize this until recently, but like, so the Taconite Harbor power line that connected LTV Erie to the coal plant was basically like a giant extension point. I mean, like, it was a non-standard voltage line that didn't fit into the broader scheme of everything. So they had to replace that, and when they did recently replace it with a 115 kilovolt line that's standard and is part of the grid. And there's a lot of, reconfiguring happening right now because the loss of Taconite Harbor and eventually Boswell, right? You're going to have to really refigure how you keep that power grid stable. And there's a lot of smart people working on that. But part of it would be, I think, a big baseload addition like this. And I think when you add storage to it, it becomes baseload. It becomes what you can rely on consistently to provide power. Well, if anyone has $1 billion, we can talk afterward. Bring your checkbook. But in all seriousness, like, I think it is a time to think big. It's a time to think, about what the future looks like. When northeastern Minnesota has succeeded, it's because of visionaries who thought big and moved forward, as opposed to sitting around and waiting for the world to catch up with us. So I would love to see that happen here. And I think Sundog could be a good place to start. So thank you for listening to me today, and I appreciate your attention.